Thank you, and good morning, and thank you for coming back. We're just a quarter of the size of our group yesterday, but I think that doesn't matter much. We're still going to talk about some very important things, and I think you all should be rewarded for coming back on the second day, so we'll think of a proper reward and make sure you get it by the end of the day. Probably that reward will be in knowledge. So I expect more people will come throughout the day, but I think we can be even more informal since we're a smaller group. So I hope we can all get to know each other even better. And actually, as a small group, we might be able to achieve more in terms of sharing of information and learning from each other. So thanks again for coming back. So I'm just going to talk to you for about 10 minutes. Really more about a bigger picture, and that picture is on the upcoming Paris Climate Agreement this year, and what role might carbon markets have in it. So for some of you in the room from Korean industry, this might seem a very far off discussion, but it's actually very important. It's very important because up until now, the International Climate Agreement has been a top-down led process where different types of organizations, countries, companies, and civil society have operated through the Kyoto Protocol, through the Clean Development Mechanism, CDM, and Joint Implementation, JI. And that's really been the basis for international emissions trading at the scale of interaction of many, many different countries, and where many of us who've worked in the carbon markets for several years have gained our experience and knowledge. And now we're entering into a new era where different countries are putting forward different carbon markets. And that means it's going to be a much more bottom-up led process. And as Korea's emissions trading system continues to go on throughout the years, it's important to recognize what role Korea's ETS will have in the broader mix of different carbon markets that will be recognized under the International Climate Agreement, which is going to be finalized in Paris at the end of the year. So IETA has been working on this issue very closely. It's very near and dear to our heart, and we believe that the International Climate Agreement needs to have a recognition and role for carbon markets in it. So I just wanted to spend about 10 minutes explaining to you our views of why this is important and how that might affect carbon trading here in Korea after this year. So let me just go on throughout the presentation. So last year, IETA teamed up with Harvard University, and there was a team of researchers there who we contracted to do some work for us. And what we asked them was, in a perfect world, if we were to be given the pen and we were to write out the section on carbon markets in the International Climate Agreement, what would we want it to say? What would be the best outcome for emissions trading in the International Climate Agreement? And so this thought exercise was carried out throughout last year, and we worked on it with Harvard, and we shared it with a number of different governments, a number of different members of the private sector, as well as people from civil society. And we came up with some rather interesting provisions, text, for what the climate agreement could say when it comes to architecture on carbon markets. So I'll get to that later on in the presentation, but that's really where we started last year and where I'd like to direct that effort of my presentation. But before I get to that, let me just show you briefly again, what's happening around the world and why we did this exercise. We did that because there are over 40 countries today that are actively putting a price on carbon. Either they have one already or they're planning on putting one in very soon. And that means a price on carbon could come in a variety of forms. It could come in an emissions trading system, like we have here in Korea. It could come in the form of a tax, like you see in parts of Scandinavia, in Mexico, and in South Africa. Or it could come in the form of an energy performance credit, which you see in India. And when you add it all up, if you add up the amount of global GDP that is covered under a price on carbon today, it's 40%. 40% of global GDP is now regulated by a price on carbon. And that means the International Climate Agreement cannot ignore this type of policy. It has to have a role for it. And that's why we're very focused on this last year and this year. Now, everybody's been saying we need a price on carbon. And this has been a very long-standing discussion. And it's gone on for many, many years. But we think with so much action happening here in Asia, particularly in China and Korea, and more countries and regions putting a price on carbon, there's more momentum than there's ever been before for ensuring that a price on carbon actually is not something that only a few type of countries or regions have. It's becoming more of a mainstream policy that most countries in the OECD have, and even more countries outside of the OECD will have as well. So, just to go very quickly about what's happening in the UNFCCC over the past year or so. We had a COP in Lima in Peru last year, and there wasn't a whole lot that happened in Lima. It was a place where governments sort of held their cards very closely, and they didn't really negotiate much. And what that meant is that as countries develop their contributions to the Paris Agreement this year, which are called INDCs, intended nationally determined contributions, they actually have very little guidance from the UN on how to write those INDCs. And that means when we get closer and closer to Paris, you're going to see many different governments take many different approaches when it comes to their contribution to the International Climate Agreement in Paris this year. And that means even more that when it comes to carbon pricing and carbon markets, we have our work cut out for us at the UN, and we need to have some standardized rules that help bring together these different policies. It also means that most of the effort on carbon market development isn't happening at the UN anymore. You know, the CDM grew out of the UNFCCC process. Nowadays, most of the hard work in terms of developing policies on carbon markets happens in places like here in Seoul, or in Sacramento, in California, or in Brussels, or in Canberra. It's not necessarily happening at the United Nations. That doesn't mean that we should ignore what happens at the UN, but it means that the UN needs to have some clear standardized rules and standardized language on how carbon markets could function with each other in the future. So, and then of course, for some of you who know the issues around CDM reforms and the idea of a new market mechanism, those issues are probably not going to see much traction this year, because the real activity has been in developing countries' approaches on carbon markets and how those carbon markets might fit in the International Climate Agreement. So today we have a draft negotiating text for Paris. It's about 88 pages long. It might be a few more pages long. And in that text, there are some options for how carbon markets could be recognized. And those options come from a number of different countries. And I've listed those on the presentation for you. Brazil has put forward an option. The EU has put forward one. Panama, Switzerland, and Bolivia as well. And there are some differences in those options. For example, Brazil is looking for language in the agreement which is very similar to the language we had under the Kyoto Protocol. The EU is looking at language where you could trade credits with other countries, but they have to meet minimum criteria and minimum standards on environmental integrity and accounting. And then Bolivia, Venezuela are basically saying, we don't want to have any role for carbon markets in the international agreement. And they're doing that mostly for political reasons. New Zealand and a few other constituency blocks of countries have put forward language in the agreement which references carbon markets, but it's really focused on carbon accounting. So where we are today in the process of the agreement is starting to converge on these different options, and countries are doing a lot of behind the door negotiating and trying to understand where they can support each other. But I think the main message I want to share with you is that the Paris Agreement will have a hook for it when it comes to carbon markets. We hope. But we think there are enough countries in the world that see the value in a carbon market and want to have carbon markets interact with each other in some sense over time. Here you have the US and China's views on how carbon markets could be featured in the agreement. And basically they've both said markets are good. They like carbon markets, but the international agreement might not need to say much on it. And the details on an international carbon market could come after Paris. Now, we don't necessarily think that would be a good outcome. We don't think it would be a good outcome because it would create more uncertainty if the international agreement didn't have enough clear, authoritative language on carbon market use. That would send more uncertainty out there to investors and companies who are operating in carbon markets already today. And so we think that there is merit in the international agreement having some language on carbon markets. But the details for how carbon markets might link and interact with each other could happen in future years. It might not be able to get the Paris Agreement might not be able to get that level of detail in it because that's a long negotiation and we don't have much time. So what will the Paris Agreement look like? Well, we think it's going to be a short document. It might be, 10 or 12 pages. You could pick it up in your hand and read it in 10 minutes or so. It'll be like the Kyoto Protocol was in the sense that it's not going to be a very long document, but it will be authoritative. And it'll be authoritative in the sense that it'll focus on the big picture items. So it'll have content on mitigation, adaptation, climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity development. And that means, the devil is always in the details. And those details on carbon markets and other kinds of issues related to international efforts to combat climate change might come in future UN decisions. But they'll always reference back to the Paris Agreement because that will be the authoritative document which gives governments the legal guidance that they need to make future decisions. And so therefore, again, it's very important that the Paris Agreement have some language on it when it comes to markets. And so that brings me back to what we did with our work with Harvard last year of what we think the agreement should say on carbon markets. And these three items are basically what we think it should have in it. Number one, we think the agreement should have some architecture. We call it infrastructure, but basically it allows for countries to transfer, imagine transferring portions of their contribution. So if the US and the EU both take a target, and we know the EU's target is going to be 40% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030. And the US target, say, is 28% below 1990 levels by 2030. We think that there should be the flexibility there for the US and the EU to transfer portions of that target with each other. So you could have an agreement which allows them to do that if they want. And the idea being that transfer function would reduce costs to companies and organizations that have to make reductions in the EU and the US and in other countries that wish to do so. And it would also have a role for a crediting mechanism. So for countries that wanted to go out and purchase abatement, to purchase credits from beyond their borders, the agreement would not prohibit those countries from doing so. It would allow them to do so. Again, the goal here is to reduce costs of compliance. And the language in the agreement has to be very high level, as I said. And so therefore, these three items help address that kind of scenario. And so this is really the text that we developed, and it's really wonky stuff. So I won't really go through it, but I'll leave it here for you to reference in the future in case this is ever of interest to you or at your company. And we basically wrote this text in the way that UN language is written. And the idea is that we provided a seed for negotiators who go to these UN meetings and negotiate different things to have an idea of what markets could look like in the agreement. And if you go back in the presentation and you look at some of the options for what governments have put forward on markets, some of these ideas are in those options that governments have put forward on markets in the Paris Agreement itself. So we're happy about that, because that means governments have taken our ideas and are trying to be constructive with them. Now, Korea is in a negotiating bloc in the UN called the Environmental Integrity Group. And they're in that bloc with Switzerland, Mexico, Liechtenstein, and Monaco. And together they form a negotiating bloc called the Environmental Integrity Group. And that group of countries aligns its positions on a number of issues. And the Environmental Integrity Group, again, which includes Korea, has put forward options for the Paris Agreement which have some of this language in it. So we're pleased about that, and we think the Environmental Integrity Group is wise to focus on this. And so really that's kind of my main message to you today, is to be aware of what's happening in the Paris Agreement, because you know your government is a proactive player in the debate, and it has put forward ideas with its constituency bloc of other countries that it negotiates with. Now this slide tells you a little bit about the CDM, and yesterday I don't think the CDM came up much. I think we might have mentioned it twice. But it's important to remember what the CDM has actually achieved, because you're going to hear a lot this year about the Paris Agreement having some role for an international crediting system and for offsets, for countries to use offsets. I say that because we've already seen two parties to the UNFCCC put forward put forward their target, the EU and Switzerland. And Switzerland's target says that they're going to use the CDM again. They're going to continue to use the CDM to meet their target. And that means all of the lessons we've learned in the CDM and the architecture we've built is not going to disappear. It might change, but because one government, Switzerland, has decided that it wants to continue to use it, that means the UNFCCC and that entire process has to continue to work on those issues, because Switzerland will lead that that debate, and it'll lead that work program within the UN. And it might not be the only country that does that. More countries might say, you know what, I like the CDM. It was a low-cost way of reducing emissions, but I don't like the way that we call it the CDM. They might change the name. They might tweak a few things or another. But there still is probably going to be, not probably, there will be an international crediting mechanism that will be a component of the United Nations International Climate Agreement. But we might not see or know how that functions in Paris, because Paris is going to be such a high-level COP, a high-level negotiation. These issues around the future of international credits and the future of the CDM will continue to be debated at the UN, and there will be a role for them in the future. Now, I don't know if Korea is going to put forward a target to the Paris Agreement, which includes the CDM. That's something for you to find out when you're with your discussions with the ministries here. But it's important to recognize the value that an international crediting mechanism provides as a low-cost way of compliance with a reduction target. And some countries recognize that value. Others don't, because they don't think there should be a role for it. So we're really in a world of many different approaches to international climate governance and action, but one which features carbon markets a lot. Both at recognizing the different carbon markets which are being developed around the world, but also one that recognizes the value of a crediting mechanism like the CDM. So I just wanted to share this knowledge with you all, and to tell you about the work that we're doing at IETA on this. I hope that the presentation has been useful and not too high level, and I'll just leave it at that.